Hey, welcome to Quarkus Insights 136. So we're going to be talking about testing, which is always an important subject, and we're going to be talking about some updates and improvements that we've made to the unit testing support or the component testing support in Quarkus. So this is something that I think people have been asking for a while, and Martin's been doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and it's now gone live to give some new ways to be able to sort of divide up how much gets tested. But before we introduce Martin and introduce this, do we have any news, Max? I shouldn't be asking you. You've been on holiday.
I have no idea. I just came back this morning. I just saw, oh, we're doing a podcast. Great. I'll be there. Yeah. That's the thing I can do today. I don't have any.
How many unread emails do you have?
What's the box? 3? No, that sounds, that's low. 3,000. I guess people were on vacation. Okay.
The moral of the story is don't go on vacation. Okay, yeah. So I think I don't think we have any news. Max doesn't know of any news. I think we've done a couple of releases, but not major ones. So I think we can jump right into today's topic. So Martin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, happy to be here today, except that we had some technical issues, but it works now. My name is Martin Kouba, and I work in Quarkus core team as a developer, working on dependency injection and scheduler and core and stuff like that. And today I would like to talk about something different. I would like to talk about component testing, but it's somehow related to CDI, so it's somehow related to the dependency injection, which is my expertise. And that's probably it.
Cool. And I think that's a really good point in general, actually, about the connection between CDI and testing in Quarkus. So before we start about the component testing, do you want to tell us a little bit just about sort of what CDI does in Quarkus and how it relates to the whole Quarkus test strategy?
Sure, of course. So CDI is our component model. So it's basically responsible for dependency injection in your components and providing other services such as, interceptors and events and so on. So basically, it's the glue that wires all the components in your Quarkus application together. So that's usually in application servers and other frameworks where inversion of control is used. There is some container which basically provides this dependency injection so that users don't create the instances of the dependencies themselves, but instead they ask the container to provide an instance. So that's the major feature of any dependency injection framework. So basically you create components and then the container manages the lifecycle of those components, manages their dependencies and so on. That's probably it. And like I said, in Quarkus we use CDI, which is, actually CDI is a standard, and we use an implementation of CDI. Right now we are even spec compatible. It's part of Jakarta, previously Java EE, and we use something we call ARC, which is an implementation of CDI. But it's a little bit different compared to other implementations because it's build time oriented. So that's the main difference compared to, for example, Welt, which is another project from JBoss or Red Hat, which is runtime oriented, let's say. And so given the fact that Quarkus CDI model is based on CDI, we wanted to provide something that makes it easier to test those components, in our case CDI bins, and to mock the dependencies, so something like an enhanced unit test. But we'll see it in our example. I have some examples prepared. So
cool. So I guess
go on. Sorry, also wanted to mention that we are going to talk about a feature which is still in an experimental phase. So we should be aware of this fact. It's not stable yet, although the API is quite stable now. But we are still fixing stuff and adding features based on the feedback that we collect currently. So, for example, last week we fixed a problem with Gradle. So right now, if you want to try it out, then keep in mind that it doesn't work with Gradle. But we have a fix, and in the next release, it should work just fine. And there are also some problems or integration issues, probably. Let's call it integration issues. Because in Quarkus, we have things like continuous testing and test profiles and so on, which is quite complex. And we want to test all the possible use cases, which is not it's pretty difficult to create, tests for testing framework. It's not easy. So we're still collecting feedback and fixing stuff and adding stuff and so on.
And maybe just, again, correct me if my vacation brain is wrong here. Just to give context, like Quarkus historically was pushing, and it's still pushing for full stack testing. Basically, hey, if you can run your database, like just run your database and run your whatever services in dev service. And don't use as little logging as possible, because it's always there that you know some issues, right? And the reason why Quarkus could do that, and the reason why we pushed for that was that Quarkus was so much was so fast and had all these different features that allowed it to just kind of work.
Yeah.
But so then we always said, I'll just finish, Martin. And then we always said that if at some point we get to a place where, hey, there are cases where this becomes a bit annoying, we will look into finding a way to do this a bit better. And that's what this thing is about. That, hey, we are hitting some limitations now where we can actually be faster if we start doing more kind of mocky kind of thing. And that's where we are. So this is to enable what people are used to, but we claim we probably don't need in most cases. But now we're down to that. Okay, there are a certain space where it makes sense, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
So back to you, Martin. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, can I add too?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's like a sign of maturity, really. That, if you think about the test pyramid, there's all sorts of levels at the test pyramid. So, at the top is, your full end-to-end testing, and then at the bottom is your unit testing, and in the middle we've had the traditional Quarkus testing, where you have quite a lot of the full stack and it still runs really quickly. But now we're adding more layers into the into the test pyramid, just because we're expanding and we want to cover as many possible requirements with the sort of the different nuances between them.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would say that the original way of testing using @Quarkus test, which is our kind of integration test, is still preferred. But like you said, there are use cases or workflows where this is not really the best option. So we just want to add or provide another option that is a little bit more lightweight compared to the original way of testing, and more closer to the unit testing. So that's the motivation. Also, I will mention it later about, we had some requests from users where in some workflows where, for example, if you don't use continuous testing or that mode, and if you want to run a single test, it might be really, it might take quite a lot of time to run a single test, because we have dev services, we have many extensions. You can have many extensions in your application. So if you want to, if your workflow is like, you want to modify some piece of code and then run a single test, then we also, of course, we have to build your application, start your application, start the dev services, and so on. So this could take seconds, for example. So there are users who are used to write unit tests because these are basically executed in 1 second or so. So that was one of the motivation, to provide some other option for users that just don't want to use the default
And I
way.
guess another consideration is that if someone is using dev services that is going to rely on containers, and some users, because of restrictions in their environment, can't use containers, and so then that reduces the number of available dev services to a fairly small number, and so then maybe you do want to look more into mocking if you're in that kind of environment.
Yep, totally.
So we had a question that came up, which is the sort of question that you never want to get if you're doing this kind of thing, which is, what are we even talking about? So why don't we rewind a little bit and just give a bit more context about what why are we here? What are we talking about? What's changed?
Yeah, I actually have a few examples, so I will probably try to share my screen, and we can start with. I would like to start with like talking about the testing story in Quarkus in general, so that we can come up with conclusions. So
Let's go.
let me share my screen. I'll try to. So. There is a demo repository which is available at GitHub. I sent a link to Max, so maybe you can write it to the chat, Max. Yeah, it's in the private chat. So in this demo, I'm going to show all the testing ways, or all the ways how to test a Quarkus application or components of a Quarkus application. And let's say that we want to test a component like this. It's called My Service. It's an application scope CDI bin, and it depends on some other service. Just a simple bean that doesn't do anything interesting. And we also depend on a config property, which is in Quarkus represented again as a bean. Except that we use shorter syntax here, so that we say inject a config property, which is name, count, and has some default value. And our component has a simple ping method, which just calls the other service, which is our dependency, and then we repeat the result based on the configuration property. So this is the service, the component we want to test. And as you see, we have some injection here, annotations, and so on. So we probably want the CDI container to handle some stuff for us. And we'll start with the simplest way, or the most common way, how you can test this component in your Quarkus application. And that's using the Quarkus test annotation. Under the hood, this annotation just registers a JUnit extension that builds your application and starts the application when the test suite starts. So we then add this test class to the application, and then you can run your tests basically inside your application. So here we say use Quarkus test, means build our application, inject my service, and then we have a simple assert that asserts that the result is Ponk in our case. So we can try to run this application. I'm sorry, I don't see test. This is my search class.
Nope.
Nope, doesn't work. My service. Come on, sorry. Don't see the command line.
I was like, what's going on? Holly is flipping around the screens.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So like I said, this is the most common way how to test our component in Quarkus. And if you look at in the log, we can see that the Quarkus application is built and run, and we execute the test. And the first test, because we need to load all the classes and probably also execute all extensions we have in our application, it takes a few seconds, right? And the problem with this approach, the way I can see it, is that it's not very flexible when it comes to testing different configurations of our dependencies and so on. Imagine that the other service calls an external service, and you need to use a mock or something like that, because, for example, it's not so easy to test an external service. What if you need to test different configuration options and so on? So this way, you can't do anything about it because we use the components the way they are defined. So in our case, we just inject my service, which is injecting other service, which returns bonk, and so on. So what options do we have in Quarkus? So if we want to test different configurations or different setup. So the first thing we could do is using test profiles. We have an example for this. Then we have an option to create a global mock. A global mock, that means that we can create a mock bean, but this bean is used for all the tests in our test suite. And finally, we have a Mockito integration in Quarkus, so that you can configure your mocks for your tests without the need for application restart and so on. We also have an example. So let's take a look at the test profile example. Okay, so a test profile example could look like this. We also use Quarkus test, but now we say we want to use a special profile, test profile, using this annotation. And the myTestProfile class is used to override configuration properties and also enable a CDI alternative. CDI alternative basically means that you can override a bean when injecting a dependency. So in our case, we have a bean called mock other service, which extends other service so that it can be injected into an injection point of type other service. But we say it's an alternative, which means that it has to be somehow enabled. And we enable this alternative purely for this test profile. So for other tests, the original implementation is used, but for this test profile, we use mock other service. And then we can assert that the result is different. So let's try it again. I'll run both of them, my service test and my service profile test. I wanted to run both of them because it should be visible that for test profiles, or the downside of test profiles is that for every test profile you use in your application, we have to rebuild and restart your application because it's using a different configuration, a different set of beans, different configuration options, and so on. So we can see in the log that we actually built and started our Quarkus application twice in this particular case, right? So it adds some flexibility to our test suite, but the more profiles we have, the more we need restarts, right? That's the obvious downside of this approach.
Yeah, for 2, it's probably okay. But if you had like 10 and then you had 10 variations for 10, then you're right, the scaling starts to not be great.
Exactly. And whilst talking about mocks, it's usually like you don't need 1 or 2 mocks, but you need a lot of mocks if you need to test all the possible combinations and use cases. So it's not very realistic that you can write like an ordinal test with mocks using this technique. That doesn't mean that it's not very useful, but it's not it's not very practical if you need to do a lot of mocking.
Yeah, I think it's probably a nice rule of thumb that like for your golden path testing, you probably want to be on the golden path that's most realistic. So using that Quarkus test and that kind of thing. But then as soon as you want to do the combinatorics testing, then maybe, because you've established the golden path works in realistic one, then you want to do the mocking for speed.
Yeah, probably. Like I said, we also have one more option, and it's called that's our Mockito integration. So this is how it looks like. You can inject your component on the test again. You can inject the mock. keep in mind that here we use a special trick that we leverage the CDI client proxies, which means that you can't use this technique for other than normal scopes, because we're basically redirecting the client proxies to the mock instances so that the original bean is still there. But when you call a client proxy, in this case, when you call other service, it's redirected to the mock we create for you. So if I can run all of them so that we can see that it works. The workflow is like you can inject your mock, then you configure the mock using the Mockito API like you use in your unit tests, and then you make some assertions. And like I said, when you call a bean, in this case my service, which is injecting other service, which is mocked, then basically the client proxy redirects the call to the mock instead of the original bean, which is still there, but it's not used. And I wanted to show one more thing. You can see that if there are multiple tests that share the same configuration, then they are somehow grouped. So in our case, we can see that these two tests, my service Mockito test and my service test, they share the same default configuration, so they can be grouped and we can execute them in one application, basically. So while this one, which is the profile test we showed before, requires a different configuration, so we have to rebuild and restart. So this is a nice feature of the test profile, that you can group the tests into using the test profiles. So that is also very common. Okay, so this is a little bit more flexible because we can basically mark the behavior of the injected dependencies without the need to restart our application, right? It is still a bit slow in the sense that if you run this application, if you run this test, single test from the command line or your IDE, then we need to execute all the extensions, build the application, start the application, start dev services, and so on. It's just, again, it's like an integration test. It's not a unit test. And now the last option you have currently is to write the regular unit tests for your components. So this is our my service unit test, where we want to do the same thing we do with the Mockito, my service Mockito test. So this is the same. This part is the same, where we use the Mockito API to mock the methods and then assert the components. But this one is interesting because if we don't start Quarkus at all, or a CDI container, then we have to wire everything together manually, right? So we need to create the instance, we need to create all the dependencies, and so on. So in this particular case, it's fairly easy because we use field injection and the test is in the same package, so that we can easily set, for example, this injection point, create a mock manually, and then set it to the field. It's a little bit more complicated when the test is in a different package. Then you need to either switch to constructor or setter injection. And again, those constructors and setters have to be public. Or the other way is probably using reflection, which is something you would like to avoid probably. And of course, this is a very simple use case. But if you have a real component, like a real bean that has like, I don't know, 20 dependencies or such, then of course this part will be much longer compared to this simple use case, right?
It does sort of show, just as a general architectural pattern, how important dependency injection is to make testing easier, as well as on the sort of the implementation side. But then for Quarkus in particular, how useful CDI is to sort of wire all of these things together in a way that's really transparent to the application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So probably it's time to show the new stuff because we're talking for a long time.
And just to be fully clear, you're showing what you can do today and a bit like you can do this, but it's tedious, right? This is not.
Yeah,
this
exactly. Yeah, exactly. That was my point. You can do this even now, right? The unit test, which is of course the fastest option because, well, actually here the most expensive stuff will be initialization of Mockito because it takes some time. But unit tests, of course, are the fastest path so that you can execute unit tests really fast.
So there's actually a question here because we actually have two, but I'll take the because it's related to this.
Could you actually?
He's saying I try using normal units.
Yeah, go again. Go ahead.
He's saying for simple cases, but then if you use log to log, it doesn't work. So is it actually possible? I'm sure he's referring to that his other components are added depending on injection of, for example, like log and others. How would they make that work in this mechanics before we get to the new one? Is that doable or?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but maybe we can show the new way and then discuss this again.
Yeah,
because
I think it's just referring if he does it like this, then add log or add anything that inject doesn't work because you have to basically set everything up manually.
Yeah, it's completely up to you. All the initialization, there's basically, if you run this pure unit test, then no container service is available, nothing. So that it's completely up to you. All the dependencies, all the stuff that is managed by the container or by Quarkus or an extension, you need to wire it up manually, of course.
But I think it's saying if you go into auto service now and add log, it will fail, right?
Yeah, for sure. You would have to create the Mockito API in a creative way.
Yeah, exactly.
Or create a constructor set of fields. And so on.
What I'm trying to get to is that even it works in a simple example, but as soon as you use something that is remotely realistic, you'll have logging and other stuff injected. That is just not. Anyway, before we go to the next one, there's another question which is more general. And is there a doc anywhere that for wider total testing from unit to CDI?
So we have a documentation for testing Go application, and I believe that all the methods are mentioned there. I mean, all the ways how to test.
I'll go find that one. I didn't find it. I'll go look. But if you, go ahead with your, showing the new way, then.
This question does remind me, though, that I did mean to go back through our documentation and put in some test pyramid context and like map each of our test concepts to the layer in the test pyramid, and I haven't actually done that. So if I had done that, we'd have a better answer.
Yeah, that's a good point. They should probably improve our docs in this way.
Yeah. And I see there is one that's getting started testing, but for example, it doesn't include packed, I think. And it doesn't
I think that there is a guide called testing Go application or something like that, and then it's more like a reference guide, but I don't remember the details. Anyway, I wanted to show the new way, hopefully. Yes. So it's before I show it, let me switch back to the Mockito integration. So this is our way, like I mentioned before, how to use Mockito to mock the beans and so on. And this is our way to do it in a Quarkus test, which is kind of an integration test. And now I would like to switch to the new way of testing. And if you look at it, it's almost the same, except that we use a different annotation here. I will talk about this comment down here later, but this is the part I would like to talk about now. So if you look at it, we use a different annotation here because we use a different unit extension that does not build and start your Quarkus application, but instead merely starts the CDI container, pardon, CDI container and configuration, so that we have all the configuration stuff from system properties and application properties and so on. And that's all. And then the test looks very similar. We inject the my service, which is the component we want to test. We again inject mock, the service. Then again, we use Mockito API to configure the mock. And the same applies here, so that we can change the configuration of the Mockito mock and make another assertion. So,
and remind me here, Martin, why is it? Again, my application brain is off, so I'm sure.
no
Why
problem.
isn't why the inject mock?
Yeah, so inject mock, this one is here because we want to obtain the tested instance of our bean. We also detect these injection points, and we basically the set of components that are tested is derived from all the injection points. You have other ways how to specify them, but by default, if you do add inject and some type, then we expect that there is a CDI component you want to test, so that we use it as is. We don't modify it in any way. We just attempt to inject the bean, right? And then there is inject mock, which is used to inject mocks that are created automatically for you. And these mocks are used in the component that is tested. So if we switch back to the my service, here the mock is injected automatically for you. The way it works is that we basically, component test, we collect all the components under the test. In our case, that's just the my service. And then normally in a regular CDI environment, you would get an unsatisfied dependency injection, something, problem, error, right? Because other service is not there, basically. So normally you would get this exception and you would need to fix it somehow, add the other service into your test and so on. But in our Quarkus component test, we consider all unsatisfied dependencies as mocks. So we basically provide some mocked version of your bean automatically for you. And then you can use it in your test so that you can configure it. This is the only, I just wanted to mention that it's not the only way how to configure a mock. You don't need to use it. We have a programmatic API for this, but this is the most common and very convenient way how to inject a mock that is going to be configured.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just my mental model is right. So by you having add Quarkus component test, the add inject is not the normal inject, but it's an inject that says, well, it's going to wait for the inject mock and others to be resolved before it happens. And what you're saying here is inject my service as normal, but make the other service a mocked one, so things be fine. Is that the...
Yeah, more or less. The way it works is that we say, we're going to test this class. Please collect all the injection points we have here, injected fields to be precise. And then all the types that are here used at injection points are going to be tested components. So that if I do, if I remove the inject more, but instead use inject other service, then this other service will be used as is again. It will not be mocked. However, yeah.
No, go on, finish. I was just going to rephrase.
But it's okay. I don't think I.
So, yeah, so I think how it works is that at Quarkus component test says please use much more mocking than you would normally, and then anything that has an at inject in the test is real, and anything else gets mocked. And if you want to configure the mock and change the behavior of the mock, then you use an at inject bulk or the programmatic way that Martin is about to show. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Keep in mind that Quarkus component test is more like a unit test, so we don't start the application in the background, and we want to test one or few components, right? It's not like testing the whole application. So usually in a Quarkus component test, you have one or several components, several beans that you want to test. And the way you say which components you want to test, or one of the ways, is to inject a component in your test. Because then we know that you will be using this component for your asserts in the test. And the way it works is that all other dependencies that are not components under the test are automatically mocked, which means that you can use Mockito to configure them and play with them and so on.
So
the
just
same.
just for me to understand here. So if, let's say my service has an other service that's mocked, but it had a third service that we didn't do anything here. What happens then? It just gets mocked, and so it's you still resolve, but then it will fail when you call it.
And is the third service injected in other service?
Or my service, yeah, or in my service, let's say that.
If it's injected in my service and you don't use it at all, then basically that's a no-op. We create something in the background, but we don't use it anyway. So it's just a no-op. We don't consider it a component under the test. In this case, we only say my service is the real class that should be used in your test. Everything else, including the config properties and so on, everything will be mocked somehow.
Okay, got it. And if the other service has the third service?
Then we don't care because other service is mocked, right?
Okay.
It's only one level, you only consider one level of dependencies.
Yeah. So basically, a normal Quarkus test assumes you want to boot up the whole thing, and therefore everything has to be resolvable. Quarkus component test says, hey, you're only going to test a small thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We only say, here is a small set of components we want to test, usually one or few others, and then everything else has to be mocked. And we start the CDI container, which is just very tiny, right? Because it only has a few beans there. And you make your assertions, and then when the test is over, we stop the CDI container and throw everything away. So it's always started. Every Quarkus component test has its own CDI container started, basically, and configuration. One may have, the question is, do I actually need this compared to this one, which is the regular unit test? So one of the questions, one of the things that it can help with is the large number of dependencies, of course. And the other thing is that we start the whole CDI container, which means that other services are up and running as well. So that, for example, if you use, I don't know, interceptors in your component, or CDI events, or callbacks, like, if my service has something like post construct with init do something. So we do, of course, you call this callbacks automatically, whereas here you would need to call it again manually. So you have to do something like init and so on. So it's easy to forget to, for example, call these callbacks and stuff like that.
And going back to that question that we had about the logging, and ideally we would use a unit test, but we have that dependency on the injected magic log. Would the Quarkus component test solve that scenario and avoid the issue?
You mean like inject logger something?
Yeah, but you don't even need to do that inject. You can just use that class and it gets magically resolved to be the right logger. It's quite nice.
Yeah.
Doesn't work in unit tests.
You mean the panache logging stuff like this? Log info something, blah blah blah. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure whether this will actually work, because I believe that Ladislav fixed that recently so that it somehow works even in unit tests, but I'm
Oh,
not really
cool.
sure. Yeah, of course there are some limitations. So while talking, we didn't show the more complex examples yet, but I don't want to go into details here. But one thing that we currently can't do is basically any Quarkus feature which is based on class transformation, because right now we don't have a way to transform the bytecode of the tested class. But again, there is a work in progress. I believe that it's again Ladislav who is working on this, and he told me like last week that he has some magic prepared for this, so that we will be able to do some transformations as well. In the context of CDI, what we do in CDI is that if you have an application scope bean like this, and if you want to use constructor injection like this, service, and say this other is service, which is sometimes a preferred way of injection, right? But the problem is that in CDI you can't do this really, because there is a requirement that any normal scope bean has to declare no args constructor like this. So what we do in Quarkus, for example, is that if we find such a class and there is a constructor like this which expects an injection, we do generate this constructor for you, so that we transform the existing bytecode, so that it's easier for users to write such beans. But this is not supported yet.
By the way, we had a question just for people to know, like, started from which version is this Quarkus component test available? Is that 3.2 or?
Yeah, so the first initial version is in 3.2, but I believe that we added some more features and fixes in the main branch, so that it will be in 3.3.
So 3.2 is the first where we had the initial versions, and what you're seeing here is probably 3.3. And just highlight, this is still, we call experimental. We want this feature to be there, like this functionality, but it's still considered experimental until we kind of mature. And this podcast is one of it, to get people aware of it.
Yeah, exactly. We're still collecting feedback, because for example, I wasn't aware that there might be an issue when running continuous testing in standalone and so on. And these are we need to test all those configurations together, because we want the Quarkus component test to work seamlessly together with other types of Quarkus tests, right? So we want it to be really fully integrated into our testing story. So that's not ready yet from this point of view. I also wanted to show one more thing that Holly asked me before this session, whether it could be used actually to do something around testing endpoints, for example. So in this application, we have this simple REST endpoint, reading results, which is a JAX-REST class. But in Quarkus, every JAX-REST class is also a CDI bean. So that in theory, you can use the Quarkus component test to test these components directly. So we have here a Quarkus component test that is going to test greeting results, which calls my service. So it behaves basically in the same way, except that here you need to call the endpoint methods, the resource methods manually. And of course, you would need to support the instances of the Jaxer stuff that is injected there. So for example, query parameters and so on. So it's possible to use it because resources are also beans in Quarkus, but it's not so seamless so far because the Jaxer stuff is not there, like the HTTP request and so on. So you need to do more mocking manually. It's possible, but a little bit tedious sometimes. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I need to check my agenda because I don't know if there is something I wanted to mention as well. I'll probably stop sharing for now.
While you're checking your notes, I can add, because I've been looking at some of the testing for testing too. And the hardest problem in computer science is naming things. And when you're trying to name your tests for testing tests, you end up with tests that are called test for the test for the test for the test, integration tests, extension tests, and it really, really hurts your head. So I think everybody should have a lot of sympathy for Martin for the testing of testing work that he's been doing.
Yeah, I want to just maybe mention one more limitation that it's obvious. Because we don't run the full application, I mean the extensions and build steps and so on, there might be problems caused by the fact that you expect something to happen because you have an extension present. So for example, speaking of the Jaxer's resources, in Quarkus, we automatically add scope annotation to every Jaxer's resource class. And of course, it doesn't happen here because we don't know about any extension and so on. So sometimes there are features like this, which are quite convenient in Quarkus, and everybody expects them to work. That might not work in Quarkus component testing. So you might need to do some more mocking on configuration and so on. So this is one more limitation we have.
Do you have an example of this one? For example?
Yeah, like I mentioned in our example with Jaxer's endpoint, you usually don't add scope annotation, but in our Quarkus component test, we only consider CDI beans. So you need to add it manually because in Quarkus there is an extension which is REST-easy reactive or REST-easy, which adds the scope annotation automatically somehow.
And by you mean you have to go add it to the actual code. You can't in your test express that in some.
Yeah, sometimes you can express it, but this particular thing is not. You need to modify your code.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
But it's just like no, it's just like adding one annotation also, which is not something which is prohibited normally because you can use it even in your regular applications, but users are used to to the defaults, which sometimes don't work.
Yeah. And that's the whole battle or complication of this is like when we started Quarkus, we didn't want to have mock tests because we believe that you end up having you're not testing fully things and things that get hidden. But of course, then over time, you build up some defaults and everything's worked fine. We testing continuous testing, we testing hardware load, etc., and all is good. But now we end up with this. We want to be able to carve out a small piece of the world and test. And because of these, let's say, magical defaults or helper things you've done, that's going to be missed. But again, this is why we want people to try and test, because some of these things we can probably maybe detect. People, hey, this error might be because you need to do this, or maybe, we missed that thing and we could add a support for it.
Yep. I would also say that it always depends on your workflow. Like if you are, for example, used to continuous testing, started in the dev mode, then you probably don't see any slowness anywhere because dev services are started and classes are loaded, and basically even an application restart is fast, very fast. So it always depends on your needs and what you are used to.
So if you have a machine that has access to Docker and you're used to using the command line to run the test as Quarkus has been promoting for like 3 years, you probably don't see this issue. But if you're coming from other frameworks where you tend to run the green button in the IDE or start the maven build on every test round, which people just kind of got used to, then yeah, Quarkus will seem a bit sluggish comparison for in the testing realm. But yeah, this allows you to do that, but then you have to be a bit more explicit about your testing. And the thing, if you are in that world, you've probably spent even more time setting up integration tests, because then that's hard in that world, where we've made it so, yeah, the mocking is a bit more tedious. It's not going to call it tedious. It's as easy as the other one. It's just you haven't been used to being able to do it, so therefore it's a bit different. So yeah. So no, very cool.
Yeah. Also,
Yeah.
Just one note: I've seen quite a few users who try to mock external services and Panache repositories and databases and so on. And this is exactly the use case where this could actually help, because in their test, they're basically testing the business logic of some component, and they don't care about, database and external service and so on. So this could also be a little bit more lightweight solution for them. Although, like I said, if you have a machine with Docker and using continuous testing, then you probably don't care.
Yeah, so sort of as a rule of thumb, then, like, just to sort of repeat what Max said and what you said, if you think you need this, then maybe the first thing is to sort of question, well, is it just that you have habits from other frameworks and you assume things are going to be hard and slow that aren't hard and slow? So maybe like check those assumptions first. But then if you've like work through those assumptions and those habits, and you're still finding it's hard and slow because you're doing permutation testing or the combinatorics, or you're trying to test the business logic on something that has a lot of real external dependencies, then maybe this is going to be really good for you. But then you do have to think about the trade-offs of you're trading off realism against speed. And so at some point you may discover that you traded off a bit of realism that you kind of wanted, and that's going to be annoying for you. But that's just the trade-off that you made.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I think it's good what you said, Hal, like earlier, that we should have it'd be good to have that testing Quarkus article updated to the pyramid, and maybe have that pyramid placed in places and go through you can do it, but do you really need it? And you do, yeah. So it's definitely very cool. Well, Martin, anything else? It is a very simple feature. Like there's not.
Actually, I only showed the most.
Yeah,
no, I actually showed only the very simple example. We have a little bit more features and more complex examples, but it's.
But
it's mentioned in the blog, and you can read the Javadoc and so on if you really need something more complex.
But so basically, just to summarize, you can now, since Quarkus 3.2, you can use Quarkus component tests to write plain unit tests that uses injection more easily. And I think it also worth reminding, because like I've used in Quarkus, I use unit tests all the time. Like I don't like you have always been able to use unit tests in Quarkus. You just wire things up manually, and then all is fine. And that's super fast, and nothing is there. What this just gives is another tool that utilizes the information that's available at build time to build up the right thing, and you can run it, and you save some manual config, or a lot of manual config. So yeah, and try it out and give us feedback, because we do want to have a stable version of this and say, hey, this is now how to do it in Quarkus. Does that summarize it? Some kind of summation, at least.
Yeah, I think so.
Awesome. And otherwise, I don't think we have. I think we answered all questions that was there. So yeah, well, I'm back from vacation, so I have no idea what's going to happen next time, but or what happened today. But I do.
Yeah.
Cool.
Next one's in
Oh,
2 weeks. That's the
2
key
weeks.
thing.
Oh, we have awesome. I can read up then. Awesome. Right, Martin and I and everyone else on the line, we'll call it a day. Say bye-bye.
Bye.